Good Shabbos. On this last Shabbos before Yom Kippur, it's quite appropriate to talk about the nature of tefillah, of prayer. There's an old argument that goes back hundreds of years that on one level you might think is just academic, but I believe that it has implications for how we lead our spiritual life and how we relate to God. So the argument is between Maimonides and Nachmanides. And Maimonides was a great Jewish thinker and philosopher. Nachmanides was also a great Jewish thinker, but more of a mystic than a philosopher. And they approach prayer in a different way. So on the technical level, Maimonides says that prayer is a biblical commandment. And he says, when it says in the Torah, La'avdo b'chol levavchem, you shall worship or serve God with all of your heart, he quotes a medrash that says, Ehuzu avoda shabalev, what is the service or worship in the heart? Zu tefillah, this is referring to prayer. And therefore he says the heart doesn't really mean the heart, it means your thoughts. And therefore, if you're thinking about God, the way to express it is in the words of the prayer. So the actual primary form of prayer is really to relate to God on an intellectual level, in your machshava, in your thinking. And it manifests itself through prayer, and therefore the Anshe Knesset Hagdol, the men of the Great Assembly of 1,000 or so years ago, we created the wording and the liturgy that we have that we use for our prayer. Nachmanides, on the other hand, says no, that the primary form of avoda, of worship, is avoda in the mikdash, in the temple, worship in the temple, which is what the word avoda actually is used for more so in earlier times. And therefore he says, really, we're supposed to slaughter animals, bring sacrifices, and bring offerings. And now that we don't have any offerings, that the temple was destroyed, we replace that with prayer. So prayer is a replacement for that physical worship of bringing offerings in the temple. So on the one hand, you would say, obviously, we relate more to Maimonides' position, since very few of us relate to sacrifice in the temple. We don't have it for so long, and it's not something we think about in those terms when we talk about worshiping God. But I think what's really important is to understand the nature of their argument. And I think what's going on here is that Maimonides is saying that the way we relate to God is more of an intellectual level, more within our thought, more within the creation of our own personality, in the sense of how we understand the world and how we understand our part in it, and then how we understand our relationship with God. Nachmanides, on the other hand, he's saying it's an emotional relationship, that our focus should be on how we relate on an action level rather than a thought level, and our emotional level rather than an intellectual level. And there we really have the important divide, and it makes a difference in how we think about not only prayer, but all of the mitzvahs that we do, all of the commandments that we fulfill, all of our rituals that we perform, all of our religious activities. Do we think of them in terms of just how we emotionally relate to God, or do we think of it as an intellectual pursuit? And it's not so simple just to create these two extremes, because of course there's a crossover between the two. That in Maimonides, he's saying that the primary form of worship is in the thought and perhaps in words, but of course he also accepted the idea of sacrifice and other forms of worship, and not only thinking about kindness, but acts of kindness. So what he's really saying is that the actions, the emotions, are a manifestation of those deeper thoughts. Whereas perhaps Nachmanides might be saying that where we start is our emotions, and their emotions should grow into our thought, into understanding our relationship with God. In other words, both have value. The question is, which one do we focus on? What's our primary form of worship? And do we conduct our lives sort of starting with emotion or starting with intellectual thought? And again, you might think this is academic, but I think it really affects the way we think of God, we think of religion, we think about how we act in this world. Do we just want to make sure that we're doing the right thing, or that we're understanding what the right thing is? Do we just wondering about how emotionally we feel attached to God and to other people? or do we worry about the fact that we really relate to them deep down? And I really think that it's something that everybody has to make a choice for themselves. And on a personal note, I would say that I generally always tend to understand the Maimonidean approach to religion and to philosophy and to the way he understands psychology. But when it comes down to it, when it comes to prayer, we always have this problem. If you're too intellectual, it becomes cold. It's very difficult to really relate. You don't think of singing and swaying when you're talking about the prayer of Maimonides. And actually, there's two different forms of prayer. There's some people that when they pray and they're doing the Amidah, when they're silently praying to God, they stand completely still. And the idea is like you're almost like an angel. You're just sort of just directing your thoughts to God. The other way is what we say in the Daven, Kol Atzmosai Tamarna Hashem Bichmocha. All of my bones say, who is like you, God? That we sway and we shuckle. Sort of this wild movements and the crying out and the motions that sometimes are attached to prayer. And although many people might think that the ideal is to really think about God and understand, we know that most people at the end of the day are swayed by their emotions. And so, although we might have the approach of the Maimonidean approach, as I mentioned before, sometimes when it comes to a day like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it's maybe good to just let yourself loose. And just, as we said in the Haftarah on Rosh Hashanah, by Chana, when she prayed before God, it says, Eshbachas nafshi ufnei Hashem. I'm pouring out my soul before God. If we have troubles, if we have problems in our life, or if we're just even happy and we want to express it, sometimes it's just good to let go and let those emotions go. And therefore, the singing on Yom Kippur, the swaying, the total involvement in the day sort of wraps you up emotionally in the worship of God and in prayer. And that might be that emotional side, which will be the more forceful one on a day like Yom Kippur. And then you work backwards and you say, okay, now I had that emotional experience. Let's translate it. What does it really mean? How do I understand it? What is it? How do I translate that into my relationship with God on an intellectual level? Do I really fully understand and commit myself to God? And again, vice versa. You might commit yourself, but then you have to act it out. So I would only suggest that perhaps Yom Kippur is a good day. You could do either, but it's a good day. Sort of let yourself go with the emotions of the day. Let the prayer overwhelm you, wash over you, take over you, and then hopefully that's the beginning of a stage of change where you feel God, you have that emotion, and then you translate it into what you really, how you understand it. And then the understanding again, then cycles back to therefore acting it out. And we're not just thinking about God, but we're living a God-like experience. Have a very good Shabbos.